Starting next year, the United States government will begin the time-consuming process of counting every person living in the country. Among the list of planned questions for the 2020 census is one that we've been asked all our lives. For some people, this is an easy checkmark in a box. For others, their response can be a little more complicated. What is it exactly that puts people in one category instead of another? A lot of us might define someone's race by physical characteristics, like the color of their skin, texture of their hair, and the shape of their eyes or nose. In the US, we tend to view race as a discrete trait, meaning people generally fit into one category or another. Maybe it seems kind of obvious to pick out a white person compared to a black or Asian or Hispanic person. Something interesting, though, is that what we call black or white in America is not the same across the world. In fact, it hasn't even been the same throughout America's own history. A person who was considered black in the year 1863 might not necessarily be considered black in the year 2019. How can this be? Race is so integral to our personal identities. We can't just decide to be a different race, just like how we can't decide suddenly that our hair is red or that our eyes are green, right? In one sense, that's true. But this brings up an important point about race that's often overlooked. What we think of as race is not based in our biology, like hair texture or eye color. Race is what sociologists and other scientists call a social construct. This doesn't mean that race is fake, not by a long shot. We know that different groups of people have different experiences in life based on their race. The phrase social construct just means that it's people who decide definitions of race, not our DNA. Race is a real thing, just not from a biological standpoint. Divisions of races into white, black, and more is a concept that people have decided upon over time. Before we jump into some examples of these shifting boundaries, let's take a step back and examine the science behind race. Most of us know that the DNA in the cells of our bodies determines our physical appearance. DNA is simply a molecule that contains the instructions for making the proteins in our bodies. These proteins are the things that control how tall we grow, how many fingers we have, the color of our skin, and everything else about us, inside and out. The information for skin color, for example, comes from a number of specific genes, or small sections of our DNA. Skin color is a biological trait that we can't change about ourselves under normal circumstances. This is ignoring environmental factors like tanning in the sun for long periods of time. Skin color is what's called a continuous trait, meaning that there's a wide range of colors that people have, from the lightest pale to the deepest brown. Part of the social construction of race is the fact that we arbitrarily draw lines on this continuum. How is it decided where white skin ends and black skin begins? Does skin tone really correlate to race? Someone born on the Indian subcontinent might have the same skin shade as a Nigerian person. Why would we consider one to be black and the other not if we're referring to skin tone? You could argue that things like facial features, in addition to skin color, determine your race. But certain types of hair or eye shape aren't limited to one race or another. For example, let's look at this picture of Barack Obama, famously known as the first black president of the United States. This is Obama as a young boy with his grandfather, a white man. Notice anything similar between the two of them? Their noses are both broad and downward pointed. Their hairlines and eyebrow shape are almost identically shaped. Even the way Obama looks as he smiles in this picture is the same way as his grandfather smiles. Clearly, these men are biologically related, but they're considered different races. It's even possible for twins to be perceived as different races, as demonstrated in this profile from the National Geographic. These girls are actually fraternal twins, and they share certain characteristics too. They both have curly hair, the same rounded nose, and oval eyes. These twins share much more DNA than Obama and his grandfather, but would still be considered different races, despite how similar they are to each other. These ideas start to poke holes in the typical definitions of race. There's no biological basis for race. You can sequence a person's genome and make predictions about what they might look like or what part of the world they come from, but there's no gene sequence that tells you the race of a person. Things like skin color are genetic, but labeling someone black or white based upon that is something that societies have decided upon over hundreds of years. The categories of race that are common today in the US haven't always been the same throughout history. One way that we can track changes in the American perception of race is by looking at categories on the census over the years. On the first census in 1790, there were only 3 options in the racial categories: free white, other free people, and slaves. The category stayed this way for 60 years until 1850, when a mulatto or mixed category was added. In 1870, categories like Indian and Chinese were added. There wasn't even an option on the census to put down other until 1910. What do these changes tell us about race in the past? Did Indian and Chinese people not exist in the US prior to 1870? Well, of course not. Society just decided to label these people differently, often linked to political motives. One example of this comes from the 1930 census, when a Mexican category was added for the first time. However, it was removed for the next census in 1940. Why would the government take away a racial categorization like Mexican? The answer might stem from the economic and political background of the United States and the rest of the world at the time. The 1940s was the beginning of the U.S. involvement in World War II. Many Americans were encouraged to participate in wartime efforts, which left a shortage of farm workers. Laborers from Mexico were encouraged by the government to go to states like Texas to take their place. It's possible that the census might have removed the Mexican category so that this huge influx of new workers could easily identify as white or some other race. This would avoid the government having to report a huge increase in the number of foreign, non-white people now in the U.S. Just like today, people didn't like the idea of immigrants stealing American jobs. Shifting racial categories could have been purposely used as a tactic to avoid the controversy. Even today, we're having similar conversations about shifting racial identities. Maybe you've heard the prediction that sometime in the near future, white people will no longer make up the majority of the U.S. population. This is what sociologists call a majority-minority America. What this means is that when combining all people who identify as non-white, their percentage of the population will be higher than those who solely identify as white. In some states like Hawaii, California, and Texas, this is already true. It's been estimated that by 2050, this minority-majority population will be true of the entire U.S. population. For reference, about 77% of the people in the U.S. currently identify as white. This change to a majority non-white population could have some significant impacts in how our country runs, especially in a political sense. That's why there's been some speculation that census racial categories are due to change again, possibly allowing more people to identify themselves as white in order to be able to report the majority population of the U.S. as white. This might seem like an implausible idea to change the definition of white, but historically, this sort of thing has happened. In the early 20th century, huge waves of Italian, Jewish, Irish, and Slavic people immigrated to the U.S., often escaping political turmoil in their homelands and seeking a better life in a new land. They were often met with hostility and outright discrimination, and definitely not considered white by Americans at the time. Today, attitudes towards the Irish and others have changed, and these groups of people are considered white. It just goes to show that racial boundaries are fluid and have changed over the course of American history. So although we can say race is not real from a biological perspective, labeling people by their race is still an important and real factor that matters. People's perceived race has a huge impact on the way they're treated their entire lives, and it's important to recognize that. In the plantation South of the 1800s, having even a drop of African blood meant the difference between spending your life in chains or as a free person. In 1806, a slave named Jackie Wright filed a freedom suit against her owner, claiming that herself and her 2 children were not of mixed African descent, but were actually Indian. This distinction mattered because Indian slavery was prohibited under Virginia law, where Wright was enslaved. She was ultimately able to prove her Indian heritage based on characteristics like having long, straight hair, among other things. The outcome of this court case changed Wright's life and was largely dependent on beliefs at race at the time. In his 2018 book titled She Has Her Mother's Laugh, Yale University professor and author Carl Zimmer provides another example demonstrating how race can both be powerful in a social context, yet genetically arbitrary. One of history's most famous abolitionists was Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery as a young man and went on to advocate for the abolishment of slavery not only in America but across the world. Although Douglass was born a slave, he came from a mixed heritage, a slave mother and a white father. In terms of his DNA, he had equal parts European ancestry and African ancestry, but he was still considered black under the laws at the time and therefore a slave. Zimmer describes one interaction in 1848 that Douglas, at this time a free man, had with a slaveholder. While giving a speech advocating against slavery, the slaveholder interrupted and said such matters should not be discussed by Negroes. Douglas replied, "I was but half Negro. My dear father was as white as himself, and if he could not condescend to reply to Negro blood, to reply to the European blood." When we think about examples like Frederick Douglass, we know that genetics don't determine your race. But the lines we draw dividing racial categories matter. The way we treat one another since the era of slavery has changed, and for the better, but there's still improvement to be made. We need to realize that race is and always has been a fluid concept. It's changed dramatically in the past and continues to evolve today. Hopefully, by better understanding the social construction of race, we can continue improving our relationships with one another while having respect for the histories and traditions that make up our unique identities. When you think about race, be critical of the walls that have been put up between us and them. Are they as important as we think?
Got royalty inside my DNA. Cocaine quarter piece, got war and peace inside my DNA. I got power, poison, pain, and joy inside